Welcome. We are very happy to have the guests and the students and the fellow faculty here today for our American Dream Conference. I'm Sandra Hansen from the Sociology Department here. Myself and John White, second here, have organized the conference for today because we think it's very timely, especially given the election coming up. I'm going to introduce someone who will make some welcoming remarks. Dr. Stephen Schneck is the chair of the politics department here, and he's director of this institute that we are meeting at. This is a policy research institute these days, and so Dr. Schneck is the author of several books, including Letting Be, Fred Felmer's Cosmopolitan Vision. It's actually a cosmopolitical vision. And he teaches history here and does the history of political philosophy, American political thought, and contemporary political theories. And he's been very supportive of our conference and one of several folks who have given us the funding to do it. So.
Thanks, Sandy. As Sandy said, my name is Steve Schneck, and so on and so forth along the way that you described. I should say, though, that I'm in the Department of Politics, not the Department of History. Although Leslie Kettler, the chairwoman of the History Department, thought that it was kind of nice that I might be joining her. I, too, would like to welcome you all to this conference on the American Dream in the 21st century. Let me take this opportunity to thank all the speakers, the panelists, staff whose work has made this conference possible. And please join me especially in thanking Professor Sandra Hansen and Professor John White for organizing, or perhaps I should say for dreaming this marvelous event. Thank you very much. The 19th century American poet Walt Whitman styled himself as the bard of the American dream. And in Leaves of Grass, he speaks these interesting lines. O lands, would you be freer than all that has ever been before? If you would be freer than all that has ever been before, come listen to me. Ages, precedents, have long been accumulating undirected materials. America brings builders and brings its own styles. The immortal poets of Asia and Europe have done their work and passed to other spheres. A work remains, a work of surpassing all they have done. America, curious toward foreign characters, stands by its own at all hazards. Stands removed, spacious, composite. Sound initiates the true use of precedents. Does not repel them or its past, or what they have produced under their forms. Takes the lesson with calmness, perceives the corpse slowly born from the house, perceives that it waits a little while in the door, that it was fittest for its days, that its life has descended to the stalwart and well-shaped heir who approaches, America, and that she shall be fittest for her day. Any period one nation must lead, one land must be the promise and the reliance of the future. These states are the amplest poem. Here is not merely a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. Here the doings of men correspond with the broadcast doings of the day and the night. Here is what moves in magnificent masses, careless of particulars. Here are the roughs, the cowboys, beards, friendliness, combativeness, the soul loves. Here the flowing trains, here the crowds, equality, diversity, the soul loves. When Sandy asked me to make a few opening remarks, I was frankly daunted by the enormity of the very idea of the American dream, much less the idea of the American dream in the 21st century. What are we talking about, after all? Low-interest mortgages and kitchens with the latest appliances? Is the American dream the Jetsons with their iPods and iPhones and robots that do the vacuuming? Or is it the Waltons calling out, "Good night, John Boy. Good night, Elizabeth"? Is it Las Vegas? Is that the American dream? Or is it the Willa Cather-esque vision so often now depicted in pickup truck commercials with whitewashed clapboard houses, cowboys clearing brush and riding fences? Are we talking instead about alabaster cities, purple mountains, amber fields? Or do we imagine the immigrants' hopes and aspirations over so many generations, especially today? That idea of lifting the golden lamp to the poor huddled masses from more ancient lands, yearning to breathe free. Indeed, is the American dream only an assemblage of the separate dreams of 300 million of us for ourselves and our families? The dreams of soccer moms and NASCAR dads, hip-hop generation, mestizos, Wall Street financiers. Or is it America's dream for herself, recognizing her many failures, crimes and uglinesses, the horrors of slavery, the genocide of its native peoples, the profound repressions of so many individual dreams? Might it be said that the American dream is still a vision for a better America? Well, welcome then, friends, colleagues, and guests, to this rich consideration of these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for those thoughtful remarks. I'm John White. Let me just take care of a few business items, and we want to get right to our panel. First thing I would like to do is publicly thank my colleague Sandy Hansen from Sociology. For months we have been planning and working on this conference, and she has worked on it, I think, even harder than I have. I know she has. And every day there's always been a detail to deal with it. Someone told me today that it's like a wedding. Well, the day has arrived and it's here, and the success of the conference already is due in large part to her efforts. So I want to thank you very much, Sandy, for everything that you've done. I'm going to introduce our panelists momentarily, but I want to raise a couple of questions with you briefly to echo Steve's thoughts. What about this nation of dreamers? That's the question we're going to try to wrestle with today. Do we still dream the dream? And what dream? Do we dream the same dream? Well, we may have an answer last night. Last night on the American Broadcasting Company television network, there was a television premiere of a new program. I happened to catch it at 10 o'clock when I was channel surfing. It was called The Great American Dream Vote, with our host, Donny Osmond. Oh, only in America could this happen. And the premise of the program, I won't go into it in great detail, but you and I have the power to empower somebody's dream. And last night we were given two choices. One was a bald man who dreams of a full head of hair, something I can sympathize with. The other, a woman who wants to open a Save the Basset Hound Senior Center. Tonight we'll learn those results. This afternoon, we're going to learn some other things about the American dream, namely what is it, how have we thought about this in history, where are we now, and I'm pleased to have such a very distinguished panel and panelists. Our first panelist I'll introduce is Jim Cullen. Jim is the author of a number of works on American history, among them The American Dream, A Short History of an Idea That Shaped a Nation. His other books are Born in the USA, Bruce Springsteen and the American Tradition, and the just published Imperfect Presidents, Tales of Misadventure and Triumph. He holds a PhD in American Civilization from Brown University. He's taught at Brown, Harvard, and Sarah Lawrence College. And he currently teaches at the Ethical Culture Fieldstone School in New York. So we're very pleased, Jim, to have you here. And I might say parenthetically that after 5 o'clock, when our sessions end, we'll have a reception in the foyer, and we will have representatives from the bookstore here, and they will have Dr. Cullen's books and others. So if you're interested, would like to purchase one, that would be just lovely. My other colleague is Michael Kimmage from the History Department here at Catholic University, at the very far end of the table. Michael holds a BA in history from Oberlin College, a second BA from University College at Oxford. He did his doctoral work in the History of American Civilization program at Harvard. He is writing a book on the intersection between mid-century anti-communism and conservatism in American intellectual history. That book is titled The Conservative Turn, Lionel Trilling, Whittaker Chambers, and the Lessons of Anti-Stalinism. And we're pleased to have you here, Michael. To my immediate right, but he is not right-thinking, is my colleague Bill D'Antonio from the Life Cycle Institute. He is right-thinking, but center-left. He is a visiting research professor in the Department of Sociology here at Catholic. His interests, of course, include religion, ethnicity, politics, and the family. Bill is the co-author of 8 books, the co-editor of 4. He served as editor of the ASA Journal Contemporary Sociology. And he is a professor emeritus from the University of Connecticut, which is something that we have in common, though when I was a PhD student at UConn, I actually never met Bill till I came to Catholic U. He has been president for the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, the Association for Sociology of Religion, the International Institute of Sociology, and the District of Columbia Sociological Society. As I said, he's currently a fellow at the Life Cycle Institute. His latest co-authored book is American Catholics Today, Voices of the Faithful. And so, Bill, we welcome all of you. Our ground rules today is that each speaker is going to take 20 minutes. At the very end, we'll open this up to questions from you, the audience, and that will allow our speakers to respond. I'd like to go in order in the program and begin with Dr. Cullen.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for having me here today. I'm delighted to be at CUA. My talk today is entitled Twilight's Last Gleaming, the American Dream and the End of the Republic. And I guess the first thing I have to say is that it's not going to surprise you when you ask a historian to describe the American dream of the 21st century when he observes that there isn't much 21st century to work with. The second thing that may not surprise you is that he'll begin his answer not in the 21st century, but in the first, BC no less, or those in more decisively secular settings are likely to say BCE, before the Common Era. What may be of more interest to you is to learn that the source of this inquiry will not be some trusty scribe from antiquity, but rather a television miniseries, somewhat different than the one on ABC. I'm thinking of Rome, which just finished its second and final season on HBO. You can get the first season on DVD. I stumbled on the show while doing some background research for a course on biography I'm preparing to teach, one chunk of which will focus on Julius Caesar. To that end, I've been reading people like Plutarch and Suetonius, along with contemporary sources like the excellent new biography of Caesar by British historian Adrian Goldsworthy. I just started to watch a TNT miniseries, Caesar, largely because I didn't want to make a commitment to a dozen or more episodes of his new show, realizing pretty quickly that Ted Turner's broadcasting ventures are a better track record with current events than past ones, and decided to move on to Rome. Almost instantly, I was hooked. For those of you who may not have the good fortune to have seen the show yet, Rome tells the story of 2 soldiers, Lucius Vorenus and Titus Pullo, who formed an unlikely friendship serving with Caesar in Gaul, and conveniently managed to be present with the decisive figures at decisive moments in the next 2 decades, culminating in the triumph of Caesar's handpicked successor, Octavian. Part of the cleverness of the show is the way in which these fictionalized characters are inserted in surprising and yet plausible ways. For example, in the second episode of the series, entitled How Titus Pullo Brought Down the Republic, the pleasure-loving veteran's gambling habit provokes a confrontation outside the forum that inadvertently triggers a civil war and the overthrow of Pompey the Great. We later learn that Pullo is probably the actual father of the child Caesar is presumed to have conceived by Cleopatra. And the end of the show sort of ties up that loose end. The moral center of Rome, though, is Vorenus, a high-minded centurion with a deep regard for the traditions and values of the Republic. Over the course of the first season, Vorenus' sense of integrity and competence lead figures like Caesar and Mark Antony to entrust him with tasks whose successful completion results in a sharp zoom in upward mobility, culminating in Caesar engineering his election to the Senate so that he can become Caesar's de facto bodyguard. But Vorenus unwillingly becomes a pawn in a larger power struggle, which results in personal as well as political catastrophe. Now, Vorenus is no fool. But as we watch him continue to maintain republican ideas amid imperial realities, and pray to pagan gods with a sense of confidence and earnestness that any Catholic would find uncomfortably familiar, the message of the show becomes unmistakably clear. Vorenus is a walking illustration of cultural lag, pursuing an idealized vision of life that has been outstripped by reality. A lot of effort has been made in producing Rome to invest the show with an impressive degree of verisimilitude. But its historiographic fingerprints are easy to detect. This is very much a 21st century take on the 1st century BC, and the preoccupations of the show's producers were more characteristic of the contemporary United States, the show is largely peopled by British actors, than the ancient world. For one thing, female characters are given a degree of attention, if not power, that seems unlikely given the emphatically patriarchal flavor of most writing on the subject. Not that this is necessarily a problem. Historical truth is always elusive. The patriarchal portrayal of the Roman Republic may have more to do with sexist historians than sexist Romans. And in any case, history is written for the living, not the dead. Rome, like any historical text, would hold little interest for us if it didn't reflect some aspect of our lives, and it requires no great stretch of the imagination to see the show as an allegory of another republic with imperial tendencies. There is no country in the world that is more directly and deliberately self-consciously based on the Roman model, Jonathan Stamp, the House Historian of Rome series, said of the United States to the online magazine Politico last month. The Founding Fathers absolutely saw themselves as founding a new Rome. End of quote. More specifically, the meteoric rise and chastened experience of the idealistic but naive Lucius Vorenus would appear to offer a rather pointed commentary on the still widely, but perhaps unwisely, cherished American dream. Now, earlier in the 21st century, when I was writing The American Dream and giving talks like this one, I used to make an argument for a form of American exceptionalism by pointing out that no one speaks of the French dream or the Chinese dream. I now see that this view is misguided and even inaccurate. Whatever errors of interpretation one might find with the show, I now see that the notion of a Roman dream is no anachronism. One of the featured characters in the show is Marcus Tullius Cicero, a man whose best days were behind him when the series opens, but who is nevertheless a pivotal player in Roman politics. This is remarkable in part because the real Cicero was known as a so-called new man, who rose to the ultimate office of consul despite lacking the usual aristocratic birth or connections. Cicero was a singular figure as a writer and orator and politician, but he was by no means the only person in Roman history to have experienced such upward mobility. Less spectacularly, but more importantly, any non-Roman soldier in the later empire who served a full term in the army of about 20 to 25 years was granted citizenship. A welfare program in a multicultural empire that mingled social inequality and cultural pluralism in a way that any immigrant to these shores would recognize. Nor are examples of such social mobility limited to ancient Rome. One can see its outlines in the Confucian civil service in Han China, for example, or in the role of the Foreign Service in 19th century Great Britain. History is replete with figures who have aspired and achieved far more than their original circumstances would seem to warrant. And here I think of Jane Austen, who I was just reading about on my way here. Her characters would fit that bill too. So what does this mean for us Americans back in the 21st century? To answer this question, it might be useful to review the concept of the American dream as outlined in my book. Now, if there's one idea I hope that readers would take away from my work, it's that the American dream is not a unitary concept, but rather a complex and multifaceted one. While the dream in the abstract might be summarized as a belief that anything is possible if one wants it badly enough, the historical reality is one of a series of discrete and sometimes competing dreams. the dream of upward mobility, which I've talked about a lot already, the dream of home ownership, the dream of racial justice, and so on. Many of these aspirations could be described as dreams of freedom, but freedom could mean any number of different and even antithetical things. The Pilgrims and Puritans of the 17th century were motivated by a dream of religious freedom, while the so-called adventurers of colonial Virginia sought instant riches. One group embraced a work ethic while marking time for a hoped-for salvation. The other hustled in a quest to get slaves to do all the work. For the Founding Fathers, the dream of freedom was political rather than religious. For the literal and figurative denizens of Hollywood, the dream of freedom was personal, a sense of effortless grace I've dubbed the dream of the coast, West Coast and coasting. Yet not all Americans were solely or even primarily focused on freedom. Some, by contrast, were dreams of equality. Here again, the Puritans are instructive. For them, freedom from a corrupt England and Holland was a means to the end of a beloved New England community. And if the reality never approached the ideal, Puritan life was marked by a sense of egalitarianism rare in Old World and New. Perhaps more than anyone else, civil rights leaders from Frederick Douglass through Martin Luther King defined the dream of the American dream in terms of equality in realms that ranged from restrooms to the content of one's character. This distinction between shared spaces and individual experiences, in turn, points to another axis on which the American dream spins, public versus private. One of the most prized aspects of the American dream is that it is deeply personal. In some important sense, as we already heard today, there have been as many American dreams as there have been Americans, about 300 million at the moment. And thanks to immigration, American identity has been something as much imagined and acquired as it has been inherited, reborn with every new citizen. Yet it is also true that the great appeal of the dream is its decisively public character. In its most mythically appealing form, American opportunity thrives in sunlight, except perhaps for The Sopranos. But we'll save discussion of that HBO series for another day. Actually, bringing up a show about organized crime is not coincidental here, for it points toward a key question that I want to put forward today, and one I hope will intersect with some of the other presentations. And that is this: what role does playing by a set of rules, also known as governance, play in fostering and sustaining the American dream? I suppose this is the policy question that I'm posing, although I'm not a policy person by training. And here I have to say that I have no ready answers. I will say that I devoted a chapter of my book on the role of the Declaration of Independence as the charter of the American dream, a charter that was repeatedly invoked by figures that included women's rights activists, populists, and anyone who ever believed that happiness could not only be pursued, but attained. I also noted at the end of my study that, quote, what makes the American dream American is not that our dreams are better than anybody else's, but that we live in a country constituted, literally constituted of dreams, whose very justification rests on it being a place where one can, for better or worse, pursue distant goals. The U.S. government, many people would say, exists to make and sustain a level playing field of dreams. And that is a belief in the integrity of this playing field that is the only thing that truly holds this diverse society together. Many of us have doubts that the government does serve this function. Many fewer of us have doubts that it should. But, as I am at some pains to note in my book, the American dream was alive and well, even nobody called it as such, long before there was a United States of America. Indeed, as historians of the American Revolution have long made clear, independence, at least initially, was understood as a struggle by the colonists who feared losing an old way of life in a reorganized British Empire, not gaining a new one. They were conservative in the most literal sense of that term. In an important sense, American society in many colonies preceded anything much resembling the powerful centralized government, and even after independence, frontier society had only most bare-bones civic institutions, much in the way of yet another HBO series, Deadwood, set in the 19th century Dakota mining town. So I suspect the American dream is more the product of a cultural environment than a political ideology, or even a particular government structure. The dream thrived in a monarchy before it did in a republic. And some of us in this room might say, the dream seems to be thriving in a civilization that has long since become an empire. In fact, some might go further and say the American dream itself is an imperial construct, a sense of possibility for some that necessarily depends on taking it away from others. In this case, Native Americans, African Americans, Mexicans, among others. There is, of course, considerable cogency to this view. It may also explain a little too much. As far as I can tell, every society has derived its legitimacy through some means of apportioning and distributing opportunity to its members, whether the society in question is that of the ancient Mayans or the presumably egalitarian Soviet Union. If we must shed our illusions about the United States' exceptionalism as being a uniquely good thing, I think we should recognize that it has not been uniquely bad. Of course, the real question now may not be the character of American empire, but rather how much longer this, whatever this is, will last. Like a lot of my fellow Americans, I fret there are real parallels to be drawn between what we call the late Roman Republic and what is, at least in name, a centuries-old American Republic. There's a reason why shows like Rome get produced, after all. I don't want to exaggerate the parallels. George W. Bush is not Julius Caesar, and Iraq is not Transalpine Gaul. It's a mistake to think that the State of the Union and the problems I and other observers see emerged in 2001. Such problems have been identified by analysts like Paul Kennedy and Kevin Phillips as originating decades earlier. I don't want to get bogged down in a highly subjective argument beyond my ken as to what degree the United States is suffering from imperial overstretch, something that was decidedly not afflicting the remarkably robust Roman legions of the 1st century BC here in March of 2007. But it takes no great skills of intellectual prognostication to observe that no hegemon lasts forever. American military power will not be eternal. Its political arrangements, always subject to revision, are likely to undergo dramatic changes at some point. Its now post-industrial economic system is in flux even as we speak. Is there reason to think the American dream will endure longer than the United States does? I believe there's reason to think that it will. One reason, which a show like Rome illuminates, is that values and culture are enormously resilient phenomena, and ones that don't necessarily respond in sync with political or economic developments. Moreover, the strongly personal and private dimensions of the American dream, diffuse and contradictory as they are not easily manipulated or affected even by larger events. Indeed, to some extent, they offer a buffer from, or even alternative to, the public square. Who among us, after all, have not reassessed our priorities in the aftermath of a professional setback or dismaying political development by rededicating ourselves to literal or metaphorical gardens? This may not be an altogether satisfactory solution. Indeed, when large numbers of people turn inward, it can have negative ramifications for a shared culture as a whole. But such a dynamic is nothing new. In good times and bad, an individualistic version of the American dream has thrived. Actually, in some sense, this goes to the heart of what the American dream is in its essence, a democratic phenomenon. It may not be qualitatively different than, say, the Roman dream of the new man, but it certainly is quantitatively so in terms of the number of people in its purview. And to go a step further, one might say that the quantity becomes a quality in its own right. Insofar as the United States is truly an exceptional nation, this must be the reason why. Nowhere in the wonderfully apt phrase of Alexis de Tocqueville has, quote, the charm of anticipated success been so celebrated and so widely and so often in our country. Indeed, we take collective pride in the very fact of its breadth, and the belief that it has, and the belief in that breadth has only grown over time. Who, I must wonder, can be happier about the success of, say, Oprah Winfrey than white people? She is a living emblem of the dream redeemed. Still, the sense of a persistence that I'm asserting here is a matter of momentum, a phenomenon that will survive in the future on the inherited capital of the past. I wish to conclude my remarks here, but not in the past or in the future, but rather in the present. What, if anything, can we or should we be doing to nurture the American dream? Will particular economic or political policies make much of a difference? Is the American dream a product of social cohesion or its precondition? Let me pose a final question whose answer is necessarily subjective but nevertheless worth considering. If the American dream was as dead as Lucius Vorenus's dream of the Roman Republic, how would we know? I should observe here that its death has been asserted many times, although it seems to have many more lives. What kinds of things would we imagine, for example, our politicians would say? You can get the answer to that question by watching the further adventures of Vorenus on Rome. I want to make clear that it's not my attempt here to be maudlin or indulge in forms of counterfactual history, which, however fashionable in the historical profession at the moment, should be at best a small part of the broader discussion today. But it does seem that we can get a better sense of what is most salient and valuable in our lives by considering what it would be like without them. As anyone who has read my work knows, I do not regard the American dream as an unambiguously good thing. Maybe, if for no other reason to figure out who and where we are, it's time to consider what the alternatives would be. Thanks very much.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers. I know it's a long trek from the history department over to the Life Cycles Institute, and I want to thank you for making it a little bit shorter. The Politics of the American Dream, 1980 to 2000. The American Dream has a physics and a metaphysics, a material and a spiritual component. The material component concerns wealth or well-being, with citizenship shading into ownership. One steps closer to the American dream by owning a house or owning a car. The material component suggests class mobility, or in simpler terms, the enjoyment of economic opportunity, a motive for immigration to America since the early European settlement. The spiritual component, the metaphysics of the American dream, is a blend of optimism and happiness, alluded to in the Declaration of Independence, in which happiness is a thing to be pursued. The American dream could be defined as the spiritualization of property and consumption, the investment of joy and dignity in consumption and property ownership. The aristocrat would disdain the spiritualization, the Christian ascetic would fear it, the socialist would claim it reinforces the power of the middle class. In America, this dream is embraced. In no other country is the voyage into the middle and upper middle class as intoxicating as it is in America, whatever statistics may say about the country's actual class structure, actual poverty, and actual stagnation of opportunity. The American dream promises immediate property and ultimate happiness, physical possessions, and metaphysical joy. The metaphysics of the American dream helps to tell a political story concentrated in the years between 1980 and 2000, though of larger scope. One half of this story is the rise of the Republican Party, with Ronald Reagan as its leader. The other half is the decline of the New Deal coalition put together in the 1930s. In the 12 years between 1980 and 1992, the entire political spectrum in the United States was moved to the right, a process that was consolidated, ironically, by the two-term presidency of Bill Clinton, who declared that the era of big government is over. Clinton bid farewell to orthodoxies that had guided the Democratic Party for some 50 years. A legendarily canny politician, Clinton was not above emulating a Republican master, and especially one who had forged a winning connection between his party and the American dream. Jimmy Carter in 1980, Walter Mondale in 1984, Michael Dukakis in 1988, three losing Democratic contenders for the White House, had failed to harmonize the American dream with the image of their party. They worried their way to defeat. Ronald Reagan embodied optimism about the American economy and the American future. Clinton embodied optimism too, but he had to reverse the policies of his party to make it credible. Only by reducing the size of government and blessing the virtues of consumption could Clinton benefit from the metaphysics of the American dream. The politics of the American dream from 1980 to 2000 mandated optimism about the American future and enthusiasm about American-style capitalism. The uncertain relationship between the Democratic Party and the American dream has a prehistory. What 1980 was to the Republican Party, 1932 was the Democratic Party, the moment when a charismatic leader came into his own. Ronald Reagan greatly admired the Democratic president who dominated mid-century American politics, and Reagan's was the admiration of one professional for another, both being professional politicians and professional optimists. Roosevelt's optimism was indeed remarkable. His biography was no rags to riches story. He was not a classic product of the American dream. He was almost a European aristocrat, born to wealth and privilege, not someone who had to work his way through Harvard, but someone destined to attend Harvard, as Roosevelt did. Yet Roosevelt had a genuine common touch. His access to the American dream, to the striving associated with the phrase, was not a matter of class, but of physical tribulation. He contracted polio and persevered. His spirit was undaunted, so that his striving seemed less like political ambition and more like the striving of common Americans chasing their national dream. Roosevelt had earned the optimism that was his trademark as a politician, conveyed by his famous smile, by his fluency with public speaking, and by his relationship to what became an admiring nation. Roosevelt was optimistic and cheerful when few contemporary political figures were. Stalin and Hitler did not exude optimism and good cheer. Even Roosevelt's ally, Winston Churchill, was an enemy of optimism and an advocate of tough-minded pessimism, of facing directly the threats of Nazi and Soviet aggression. Roosevelt was an optimist in hard times. His optimism carried a political message. Liberal democracy can survive, the American system can survive, and the American dream, whether physical or metaphysical, need not be discarded. Nevertheless, the hard times were central to Roosevelt's career. The Great Depression began in 1929 during the presidency of Herbert Hoover, and Roosevelt came to power in 1932 because he was alert to the experience of hard times. Hoover had tried to be optimistic as a Depression-era president. He had tried to stave off panic and to emphasize that economic downturns are often short-lived. His optimism is now proverbial for its inadequacy. Roosevelt offered the recipe of greater government involvement to a nation with widespread employment, with a financial sector in crisis, with its agriculture and economy moving in downward spirals. The key to the New Deal was the desperation of the average citizen, and Hoover had no way of addressing this desperation, while Roosevelt did. New Deal policies were Roosevelt's answer to desperation. Roosevelt downplayed the metaphysics of the American dream. He did not spin phrases about the intoxicating pleasures of owning property, about the happiness that emanates from home and car, and from the efforts needed to acquire them. These pleasures were too far from the reality of the Great Depression, even if they remained an object of desire for many Americans. Roosevelt concentrated on the physics of the American dream, especially on employment, and he did so with an optimism that was provisional. The American dream would come back in the future, when the Depression was over. Meanwhile, the president's policies bespoke a crisis of political economy. The New Deal coalition, which lasted for decades, was born in hard times, when for many the American dream was a dream deferred. Superficially, the 1970s bore some resemblance to the 1930s. The post-war prosperity that overtook the United States and Western Europe started to ebb in the early 1970s. The French called the 30 years after the Second World War the 30 glorious years, a glory drained by global energy crisis and the ensuing economic slowdown. As in the 1930s, the specter of a dark future loomed. It was a good time for pessimists who could point to the American defeat in Vietnam, to the Watergate scandal, to the drying up of good jobs, to the degradation of the environment, to the vulgarity of American culture in the 1970s, and say that worse was yet to come. If the 1970s were like the 1930s, then the old recipes might be in demand once again. Was this not a time for a new FDR, who could preside by extending the beneficent hand of government, by enlarging the safety net, and asserting the regulatory impulse? Jimmy Carter used a more modest word than depression to describe the late 1970s. He said that America was living through a period of malaise. The word came to haunt his presidency, as did the sense that, unlike FDR, he had no recipe for hard times. He may still have had the New Deal coalition behind him, a diverse collection of voters accustomed to supporting the Democratic Party, but his presidency was harried and difficult. It took on the coloration of a final chapter and not of a new beginning. Americans could look to Carter and feel that the American dream was either destined to break apart, a casualty of malaise, or that the American dream was itself a participant in malaise. The material advancement was too expensive, too harmful. It was vaguely immoral. Carter turned down the heat in the White House and sold the presidential yacht. The symbolism was not intended to be esoteric. There were many reasons Carter lost to Reagan in 1980. A subtle reason involved Carter's public worries about the American dream. Carter did not have FDR's talent for balancing optimism and pessimism, and the crisis of the 1970s was smaller than that of the 1930s. Behind it was the very recent memory of booming prosperity, of an economic expansion almost without precedent in American or indeed in human history. A conservative political movement had been developing long before 1980 with the explicit ambition of shattering the New Deal legacy. Born in hard times, the New Deal coalition itself fell on hard times in the 1970s. Slowly, the Democratic Party had grown more backwards-looking than forward-looking, orienting itself less around future dreams than around future anxiety. If past achievements were forgotten, if the New Deal safety net were undone, the future might be truly dark. After the revolutionary heyday of the 1960s, the American left discovered pessimism in the 1970s. Carter's moderate pessimism, and further to his left, a pessimism about the ineradicable racism and inequality of middle-class American life. In 1980, Reagan's emotional anti-communism helped get him elected, but no less important was Reagan's access to the American dream in the domain of domestic politics. While Carter was distancing the left from the American dream, Reagan was trying to associate the American dream with the conservatism and the Republican Party. The physics of the American dream, the actual state of the American economy, under Reagan's presidency was ambiguous. In part, the 80s was a prosperous decade. The affluence was enjoyed by many, and it was implicit to Reaganomics that consumption would and should drive economic expansion. Under Reagan, the heat in the White House was presumably turned back up. Reagan may not have bought back the presidential yacht, but he allowed himself a lavish inauguration in 1981, mocking Carter's austerity. Nancy Reagan's expensive dresses graced a new White House, the resplendent terminus for an American dream that Reagan could easily represent. He had grown up in a poor Illinois family, a child of the Depression who became wealthy by virtue of his talents, first in Hollywood and then as a spokesman for General Electric. Franklin Roosevelt may have felt closer to America's poor. He may have shown them greater empathy and believed that their concerns were the concerns of the federal government, but Reagan came from poverty. Therefore, his wealth had the sanction of the American dream. This was only one storyline from the Reagan years. The other storyline was one of poverty and relative hopelessness. The bottom third of the economy was in shambles. A confluence of poverty, drug abuse, racial segregation, and urban decline yielded a special kind of American misery, visible on the streets of Detroit, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and indeed of Washington, D.C. in the 1980s. Classically, the American dream promised what Europe could not deliver: greater prosperity for greater numbers, chances that could more easily be claimed in the New World than elsewhere. Yet the inner-city poverty of the 1980s was worse than the poverty of Western Europe, the blight more severe. The American dream implies a doctrine of progress. The physics of the American dream in the late 20th century reflects both progress and decline. Where Reagan excelled was with the metaphysics of the American dream. His biography was one part of the equation. His rhetoric was a greater part. His was a conservatism that could accommodate progress, conservatism with no antipathy for modern America, no antipathy for technology, no antipathy for capitalism, no antipathy for the dynamics of change. Reagan could be pessimistic, but it was a pessimism that underscored the optimism of his social vision. Reagan was pessimistic about the federal government, labeling government the problem, not the solution. The ills of the 1970s, to which Reagan was no less sensitive than the gloom-ridden Jimmy Carter, were the ills of over-government in Reagan's eyes, and over-involvement of government in the lives of individuals. too many burdens had been placed on the shoulders of the free market, weighing down public and private sector alike. FDR had promised that government could right the wrongs of the free market and renew the American dream for average Americans. Reagan reversed the argument. It was government that stood in the way of the American dream. Scaling back the role of government would only bring Americans closer to the American dream. Reagan's understanding of the American dream was grounded in the individual, not in government. The size of government had to be reduced for the sake of individual self-improvement. Reagan's optimistic individualism, which was and is enormously popular in this country, outlines a paradox at the heart of the American dream. Though it is by definition a national dream, the agent of the American dream is not the nation. The dream is dreamt by a nation of individuals. In the 1990s, the Democratic Party recaptured the White House, recapturing the individualistic American dream with Bill Clinton. If the crises of the 1970s recalled those of the 1930s, the giddy money-making of the 1990s evoked the Roaring Twenties. Both decades, the 1920s and 1990s, were golden ages for the American dream. Under Clinton, a technological revolution dovetailed with dramatic economic growth. The resulting conspicuous consumption was yet another enactment of the American dream. Once again, the metaphysics of the American dream obscured the physics, as the bottom half of the economy either benefited little from the boom or descended into greater indebtedness and insecurity. In political terms, Clinton could profit from the dream's brilliant metaphysics, with Bill Gates as its patron saint in the 1990s, without having to linger over the problems beneath its surface. Clinton did not struggle to save the economy from malaise or depression. He was certainly fortunate in that regard, but his good fortune was also a repudiation of his party's history. Clinton was a new kind of Democrat. From Carter's failure and Reagan's success, Clinton had learned how crucial the metaphysics of the American dream is to American politics, what price one pays for denying it, and what one can win by presenting oneself as a spokesman and specimen of the American dream, presenting oneself as the poor boy from Hope, Arkansas, who had become president. Clinton put an end to the New Deal coalition by putting an end to the New Deal mentality, in which the American dream was by necessity often a dream deferred. An aura of crisis had inspired a socialization of the American dream, as it had the notion of the American dream as delayed gratification. Whether a Democrat or Republican was in office by the year 2000, the political drift was towards the immediate and the individual, a tendency encouraged by bipartisan appeals to the American dream. The metaphysics of the American dream describes a formula for political victory, especially in times unspoiled by acute crisis and despair. Anyone running for office should study the metaphysics of the American dream very closely. It is such a powerful principle that it now transcends party politics. The metaphysics of the American dream, the spiritualization of ownership and optimism about social mobility, a faith in the capacities of the individual, is worrisome not for what it tells us about Americans and ownership, or about Americans and individualism. It is worrisome for the limits it places on political speech and action. Pessimism can be salutary. At times it is the only honest way to assess the relationship between present and future, in which dream, fantasy, and nightmare all play a role. A weakness of American politics since September 11th stems directly from the metaphysics of the American dream and from its bipartisan popularity. The pessimistic imperative that interrupted American life on that day underlies much of the response to September 11th. The fear that such attacks will recur in the future, the fear that the hatred behind them will intensify in the future, the fear that too little will be done to deal with the threats of a post-September 11th world. And yet the official politics and rhetoric have been startlingly optimistic. The polity will continue as before. It need not fear, it need not sacrifice. And one day the American dream will find a home in the Middle East, and its young people will turn from homicidal fanaticism to the productive tasks of citizenship and ownership and prosperity. This may be a noble dream, and it is surely an American one, but it is, alas, a dream at odds with the realities of the physical world. Dreams cannot be measured by other dreams. They are best when approached for what they are, as alternatives to reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thinking about today's session, the first observation I want to make is that book titles matter. Let me pick up where Michael left off in a way. Some years ago, I wrote a book called The New Politics of Old Values about the Reagan period. And as I was finishing the book, I didn't have a title in mind, but the publisher had one. They wanted to call this book The Gipper Factor. If they had succeeded, I would know none of you today. I insisted that they come up with something different, and finally we agreed on The New Politics of Old Values. This was a problem that affected a historian, James Truslow Adams. Adams, whose book I brought with me today, is titled The Epic of America. But that was a title that Adams didn't want. Rather, the title he wanted was The American Dream. And in fact, throughout the entire history of the United States, as he describes it in his book, that is the theme that he weaves into it over and over again. For example, here he is describing John Quincy Adams. He wrote that Adams believed his country stood for opportunity. The chance to grow into something bigger and finer as bigger and finer appealed to him. Alas, the epic of America. Adams understood that the American dream is really tied to crucial American values, and these include individualism, freedom, equality of opportunity, nationalism. Let me come back to Adams again, and I'm quoting him with apologies to women and Native Americans. Okay. Beginning with a guard scarce sufficient to defend the stockade of Jamestown against a few naked Indians, we grew until we were able to select from nearly 25 million men of military age, such millions as we would to hurl back at our enemies across the sea only 9 generations later. A continent which scarce sufficed to maintain 500,000 savages now supports nearly 250 times that number of as active and as industrious a people there are in the world. Here is a book that celebrates the American dream and celebrates America, and it was written in 1931, in the middle, well, not even the middle, but at the onset, of course, of the Great Depression. Whenever the United States has been in trouble, successful political leaders have been able to revive the idea of the American dream. This is something where I agree with Michael Kimmage completely when it comes to Ronald Reagan. Although Reagan's concept of the American dream was certainly tied to a materialism. And in the polls in the 1980s, when Americans thought about the American dream, it was about getting rich. It was about being the president of the company. Let me quote Reagan at a 1983 news conference. What I want to see above all is that this country remains a country where someone can always get rich. That's the thing that we have, and that must be preserved. Mario Cuomo, a Democrat at that period of time, and a very successful New York State politician, wrote a book called The Diaries of Mario Cuomo, and in it he describes how his family history was the embodiment of the American dream, something that Cuomo did over and over and over again when he was governor of New York. And parenthetically, I lived in New York State at the time, and every week there was a program that was New York Politics in Review, and we'd hear Cuomo come on, say, and here I am, the governor of the greatest state and the greatest nation. In his autobiography, Cuomo says, Papa came in 1926 without a penny. Half a century later, the family he and Mama started here are enjoying the milk and the honey of the greatest and most abundantly blessed nation in the world. Just the idea that I'm considered a choice for governor is a dramatic illustration of what this country means. It is the definition, said Cuomo, of the word opportunity. Opportunity is the key component, I think, of the American dream, and what gives it power is not just the tie to individualism or freedom, but to equality of opportunity. Tocqueville was right, as he was right about so many things. But he was right when he said that of all these values, equality is the premier one, Because while our freedom could be taken away, the idea that you and I are equals could never be taken away. We could be jailed. We could lose our freedom. But the idea that we think of ourselves as equal is extraordinarily important. In his book, Adams gets at this at the very end, in which he says, I once had an intelligent young Frenchman as a guest in New York, and after a few days I asked him what struck him most about his new impressions. Without hesitation, he replied, the way that everyone of every sort looks you right in the eye without a thought of inequality. It is that tie of the American dream to this notion of equality. Adams talks about the common man standing up and the American dream empowering the common man to stand up. By the way, that idea of growing into something bigger and finer, that idea that you and I can be as big a person as we want to be, empowers the American dream considerably. Studs Terkel, the noted chronologist, I think, of American life, he interviewed a factory worker way back when, in which that worker told him, if my kid wants to work in a factory, I'm going to kick the hell out of him. I want my kid to be an effete snot. I want him to be able to quote Walt Whitman, to be proud of it. If you can't improve yourself, you can at least prove your posterity. Otherwise, life is not worth nothing. This faith in this kind of aggressive equalitarianism has really made the American dream appealing to the ordinary citizen. It's the common man and the common woman who figure most prominently in the dream's persistence. They give birth to it. They sustain it. Successful politicians, as I said, realize that. And thus, in their autobiographies, like Mario Cuomo and others, they give voice to the American dream. In 1968, Richard Nixon accepted the Republican nomination for president, in which he told the delegates at the Republican convention that the great majority of Americans, the forgotten Americans, are the ones that give the lift to the American dream. And then Nixon repeated his own story of poverty, of growing up in California, of hearing the train whistles at night, of dreaming where he might be able to go. Nixon said, I want to make that dream come true for you, and if not for you, for your children. Now, historically, we have celebrated the American dream. Adams did it in 1931 in the midst of a Great Depression. I want to give you one other celebration that I think is illustrative. November 20th, 1967 is not a day that we think of like 9/11, but it was an important date in American history, because on that date, the population of the United States exceeded 200 million Americans. When the census had a large board with the population count, and when that happened, at the Commerce Department, loud cheers rang out. And President Lyndon Johnson gave a speech at the Commerce Department to mark the occasion. Though I must add, for my historian friends, parenthetically, Johnson believed that the 200 millionth American had been born several months earlier in Texas. But that said, Johnson said in his speech, we see a nation today that is rapidly approaching the time when more of her young people will be attending college than not. That's a revolutionary concept. We see a nation of unimagined wealth and increasing opportunity for most of our people. Sometimes we forget that the term middle class used to be a term that described a small minority. We see a nation ready to fly to the moon and explore the depths of the ocean. We see a nation fiat, having begun its own climb up the mountain, that has neither forgotten nor forsaken those people throughout the world who want to grow and who want to prosper in their own ways. To put it in a sentence, we have seen success in America beyond our wildest dreams. Johnson wasn't the only one that was triumphant. Life magazine dispatched a cadre of photographers to find the 200 millionth American. They anointed a baby boy in Atlanta, Georgia with the title. Newsweek welcomed the unborns the newborn proclaiming the bigger is better. Is almost an article of faith, said Newsweek, as American as turkey on the Thanksgiving table. Richard Scanman, who later became a very well-known political analyst but worked in the Census Department, wrote an accompanying article in Life magazine, that 1967 issue on that 200 millionth American. And Scanman envisioned what would life be like when this baby, born in 1967, turned 21 in 1988. Here's what he wrote. The bourgeois, accomplishment-oriented, middle-class values will still predominate despite the hippies' protestations. Most people will still like their creature comforts and the better life, and as they always have, will be trying to get what they can out of them. 21 years from now, a backyard swimming pool will be as common as a color TV set is today, and central home air conditioning will be the norm. With the shorter work week, most people will still be able to get a second job to help them pay their bills. Now, what's interesting to me when you think about this is all of that is written during the middle of the Vietnam War, at a time when Americans had come to a judgment that this war was a failure and that the Johnson presidency was forever to be marred by his involvement in Vietnam, even if it was to be celebrated for the achievements of the Great Society and civil rights. It was a time of discontent in America, a discontent that Richard Nixon was able to seize on when he ran for president in 1968. Things have changed. And things have changed perhaps not for so much the making of an idea, which was the title of my talk, but now I'd like to change my talk title slightly to the unmaking of an idea, ? Here's another date in history, October 17th, 2006. Again, not like 9/11. 9/11 we all remember, but October 17th, just a few months ago. Here we had another milestone, the birth of the 300 millionth American. In fact, it occurred, says the Census Bureau, at precisely 7:46 a.m. that day. If people represent power, the U.S. is certainly a world force. Only China and India supersede it in terms of sheer numbers of people. The United States certainly grows exponentially, and that's a testament to the vitality and virility of the people. Look, it took us only 139 years from our inception to get to 100 million. It only took 52 more years after that to get to 200 million. It took 39 years to get to 300 million. And yes, for our students here, by 2045, it's estimated that the United States will top 400 million Americans. But what happened on October 17, 2006? Was there a presidential speech at the Commerce Department? No. Were there celebrations? No. What happened at the Census Bureau? The day before, a spokesman said that plans were still being finalized, saying, I don't know what, if anything, we'll do in the way of an event. Well, what they did is the Bureau employees were treated to a slice of cake, a bit of punch, and then went back to their counting. The arrival of the 300 millionth American in 2006 was not an occasion for celebration. Rather, it was the occasion for commentary like this one in the New York Times. Paul Theroux, the novelist, wrote an op-ed piece in which he said that the United States was once, he said, a country of enormous silence and ordinariness, empty spaces. And now he says, that roomier and simpler America is gone. It was not an occasion for celebration, it was an occasion for mourning. Come back to Adams. He says that the epic of America loses all its glory without the dream. The statistics of size, population, and wealth would mean nothing to me unless I could believe in the American dream. There was a sense in 2006 not of celebration, but of something lost. Barack Obama, whose book I brought with me, is titled The Audacity of Hope, but the subtitle is Thoughts on Reclaiming the American Dream. as if somehow the American dream is lost or at least misplaced. Pat Buchanan writes extensively about the crisis, the state of emergency, he says, that faces the United States today based on immigration. But what he's really also writing about in a different way and from a different perspective is an American dream being lost. And the American people seem to agree with this. A recent Opinion Research Corporation poll. Do you agree or disagree that the American dream has become impossible for most people to achieve? Agree 54, disagree 45. Here's another question. Please tell me which statement comes closest to your views. Most people today face increasing uncertainty about unemployment, stagnant incomes, paying more for health care, taxes, and retirement, while those at the top have booming incomes and lower taxes. Or, our economy faces ups and downs, but most people can expect to better themselves, see rising incomes, find good jobs, provide economic security for their families. The American dream is very much alive. Well, 64% of Americans agreed with the first statement, but only 32 agreed that the American dream is still alive, and only 23% of them agreed with that statement strongly. Something is amiss. This is very different from 1980, because in 1980, we were talking about a crisis of confidence in our leadership, but not in America itself. The malaise was an opening for Reagan to win that election, because Americans rejected the idea that the country was in a malaise. I think what's interesting of listening to Michael and having read his remarks beforehand is that everything that he said about Jimmy Carter, you could say today about George W. Bush. I want to come back to that 1967 speech of Lyndon Johnson's for a moment, because I think at the end, Johnson really posed a very fundamental question. And before I do that, actually, I want to just give one more poll result. How are we doing? How would you grade the country on giving our kids the ability to fulfill the American dream? Here, the country's pretty split. A, 15%, B, 38%, C, 34%, D, 8%, F, 4%. So if we're not failing, we're still not doing all that well. And then what does the American dream mean to you? What's interesting to me on that is the tendency toward more spiritual responses, happiness, contentment, peace of mind. This was a leading indicator. So was financial security, opportunity, having a house, home, and so on. Let me come back to that Johnson speech at the end. Johnson said in 1967 at that Commerce Department speech that Americans have had to ask themselves three fundamental questions in their history. At the beginning, quoting Johnson, the question was, shall we be a free nation? 100 years ago, we asked ourselves, shall we be one nation? 35 years ago, we asked ourselves, shall we then be a humane nation? That was the question in 1932. Johnson said that every generation answered those questions in the affirmative. And then he posed a fourth question. Shall we be a great nation? Johnson noted that this difficult challenge, quoting him, was one that was to be bequeathed to the third century and for the next 100 million Americans to provide the ultimate answer. Thank you.
There we are. Look at all the help. Thank you, Sandra and John, for allowing me this opportunity to reflect on the American dream. I had access to Dr. Cullen's paper for the longest period of time, so I decided to use it to frame my own remarks. Now, those of you who were here and heard Dr. Cullen's paper, you know, he opened his paper by providing us a rather engaging overview of the popular HBO series on ancient Rome and the very real existence of the Roman dream, as, of course, imagined, as he acknowledged, by American scriptwriters. Now, I prefer to open my discussion here this afternoon not by returning to ancient Rome and my ancestors, but rather returning instead to a date 67 years ago, when my sixth grade teacher asked me to recite a poem in honor of George Washington's birthday. I dare say I don't think any of you heard this poem. The poem was written in the manner of how a first-generation Italian-American might say it. So, with apologies to my ancestors, I offer you a few words from the poem. You know what the fort is the school let out this holiday, my son? No? Well then, I'm going to tell you about the little George Washington. When George was a little kid, he's lived a long time ago. And the poem goes on to tell the story of the cherry tree and all the lessons learned. And it ends, and so my son, you too, if you work hard, if you no tell no lies, you too can grow up and become president of these United States. Now that's not bad for the teacher's effort to get us kids, primarily Italian and Irish kids in the sixth grade, to believe in the American dream. Now, since the subtitle of today's conference is a pre-election year discussion, I feel that my stumbling upon this old poem when I was trying to throw out some old files, that's a lesson to be learned, never throw out old files, was a kind of prophecy. Well, not of the quality of Isaiah's prophecy, of course, but still, I am now able to stand before you and announce that Rudy Giuliani will become the first president of Italian American of this United States. On a more serious note, and John, you told me it was going to be McCain, I was pleased that Dr. Cullen acknowledged that other peoples and other times, probably in these times also, had their own version of the American dream. A couple of weeks ago, I asked an old friend who was born in Croatia if she thought there was such a thing as a Croatian dream. She thought about it, and she said yes. In her family still living there, as well as the ones who have come here, a college education was the parents' dream for their children. And clearly, she said, some there and most here have accomplished that dream. Now, of course, to limit the dream to education is to make of it a unitary concept, and Cullen makes clear that it is in fact complex and multifaceted, a crucial point if we're to make sense of it in our history. It can be, of course, as abstract as freedom, as several of our speakers have already noted, or as concrete as owning your own home. And the dream, of course, is both very personal, as noted again by our speakers, my college education achieved by me, and in a great degree social. The Equal Opportunity Act, the Voting Act of 1965, the GI Bill. Cullen asks this among many questions. What role, he said, and then you heard him, I'm sure, what role does playing by a set of rules have in fostering and sustaining the American dream? Well, to me in the sixth grade, it was clear that I too could become president if I no tell no lies and no work hard. I dare say the latter is very important, playing by the rules and believing in the rules, to sustaining the dream. In all too many situations, for all too many Americans, when there is one job opening for the role of manager, and there are 130 equally qualified applicants, it softens the blow when you don't receive the job that some Mr. X or Ms. Y just somehow worked harder, was a bit more skilled, rather than being stuck with the belief that he or she was, after all, the daughter of the owner. There's a book, The Hidden Dangers of Class, 1970s, which treats this matter very well. Which makes important also Dr. Cullen's assertion that we're supposed to believe that the American government maintains a level playing field for all of us, that such concepts as freedom, democracy, equality are real for all of us, in part because of the role of government. That needs a bit more examination. Cullen, after reminded us that the dream seems more the product, after all, of our culture than either a political ideology or even a particular government structure. Now, it happens that Dr. John Zogby made available to us some data from his many polls on the American dream, and this one seems highly relevant here. One of the questions he asked was about the importance of government in helping to or hindering people from achieving the American dream. As I recall, this was in 2001, 6 years ago. And he controlled for religion. That's a bit, okay. That's not the one I'm referring to, but we're coming to that. That's okay. All right, anticipation. Part of the American dream. 2 out of 3 Catholics, Protestants, and Jews said the government was not very or not at all significant in helping them to achieve the American dream. 2 out of 3 Americans, 2 out of 3 Catholics, 2 out of 3 Protestants, 2 out of 3 Jews said that the U.S. government was not significant in helping them achieve the American dream. Think about that. We may want to ponder why that could be so, given, as Dr. Cullen points out so on the paper, the importance of all the government has done, from the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the amendments, making ownership a reality for more people than in any other country in the world, the GI Bill that changed the world of higher education for so many of us here, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Or is it possible that when they were asked that question, they weren't thinking about the GI Bill? They were thinking about that damn government that won't let us say prayers in school. That government that won't allow us to have the 10 Commandments on the lawn of the courthouse. What were they thinking about? Dr. Cullen has a number of important points, and I want to focus on one of them here, namely that in good times and bad, an individualistic version of the American dream has thrived. The recent housing boom in the U.S. in the face of the war on terror, not unlike Dr. White's comments about 1967 in the face of the Vietnam War. It's an interesting case in point. Of course, there's now the housing mortgage catastrophe looming for all those dreamers who forgot about taking Economics 101. But my focus here on the strong note of individualism in the American dream is on a series of questions used by Dr. Zogby, now showing on the overhead, over the past 10 years. I returned to this finding that relates religion and the American dream. Let's look at the question. Between 1998 and 2005, Dr. Zogby asked the following question 4 different times, as it shows up there. For you and your family, is the American dream mainly about achieving material goods, or is it about finding spiritual happiness? You notice that I think Dr. White also made some comments from other polls. In 1998, 1 in 4 Catholics, 1 in 5 Protestants, and 3 in 10 Jews said it was about material goods. A majority of Catholics, a larger majority of Protestants, and half of the Jews said it was about seeking spiritual happiness. He asked the question again in 1999, no change, but it's about putting figures down. In 2001, notice, the Catholic percentage has thinking it's about material goods has jumped to 1 in 3. And the Protestant one has jumped 11% to 29, and Jews 46. And for the first time, he asked Muslims the same question. 2 out of 3 Muslims see the American dream as primarily about seeking material goods. Now, notice what's happening to spiritual happiness at the same time. It's dropping. And by 2005, 2 years ago, a little over 1 year ago, we find American Catholics are now split 41-42 as to whether the dream is about material happiness or material goods or spiritual happiness. And now we have half of Protestants saying it's about spiritual happiness, down from 61%. The Jews have now switched, and Muslims continue to insist it's primarily about material goods. Well, what's it all mean? We can readily define, of course, we've heard that the material goods refers to homes, cars, and so forth. Perhaps wonder, what do they mean by spiritual happiness? What is there in the dream that may provide spiritual happiness? Dr. Cullen lists concepts like freedom, equality, democracy, and the Declaration of Independence as fundamental to the growth and persistence of this dream, and these may indeed be fundamentals for whatever spiritual happiness refers to. In the 7-year period, 1998 to 2005, the percentage of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, as you see, saying that the dream is primarily about material goods has gone up so significantly, while the percentage saying spiritual happiness has declined almost as significantly. Does this reflect on the individual's sense of well-being, despite the housing slowdown, or the failure of the religious right to maintain their control over national affairs? Does it give support to Professor White's concern about how the new immigrants, the changes away from the politics of what he calls the politics of comfort, to the politics of discomfort, which have the effect of emphasizing individual material aspects of the dream? Perhaps one of them will respond to this finding in the question and answer period, or you may offer your own response. 2 years before Zogby's first use of the question relating to material goods, at least the first use that he made available to us, Robert Wuthnow of Princeton addressed the question in his own effort to understand the American dream. His book is entitled Poor Richard's Principle, Recovering the American Dream Through the Moral Dimension of Work, Business, and Money, 1996. Thus, 11 years ago, Wuthnow asserted that for most Americans, our lives were not principally about making money, but of realizing human values. In other words, people work to give a legitimate account of themselves. Using the 200 in-depth interviews that he had available to him to supplement his national sample of 2,000 Americans, Wuthnow found that people saw work and the money it produced as enhancing their freedom. That is, their ability to make choices. But, he said, the very nature of our economy leads to much stress and often, too often, more restrictions on their options than they had anticipated, which only increases the stress. According to Richard Mattson, in a critique of Wuthnow's book, Wuthnow depends too much on ascetic and even an expressive kind of moralism that are deeply rooted and embedded in American Protestant culture. And their focus, of course, is on the individual. Mattson compares that view with the 1986 Bishop's Pastoral on the Economy, which some of us remember. The bishops take a different perspective on the economy. They ask the macro question: what does the economy do for and to people? How do people participate in the economy? The bishops were worried then that the pressures of the market present some people with impossible choices between struggling to keep their jobs and paying adequate attention to their family. For Mattson, Wuthnow offers a Protestant approach to economic morality, the expectation that good individuals lead to a good society, while the Catholic social teachings, embodied especially in the Economy Pastoral of 1986, search for the common good, the expectation that since the dignity of the human person is realized in community with others, a better society will produce better persons. 11 years later, are these differing religious perspectives helpful to our understanding of the present? Is some dialogue between them helpful? In my closing comments, I want to link the above question about religion as individual piety with religion seen in the macro level. In 1884, the Catholic bishops met in Baltimore, and they formally committed the church in the U.S. to build a parochial school system that became the heart and soul of the great Catholic parishes that dominated so much of Catholic urban life through the 1950s. That achievement seems to me the example par excellence of the American dream writ large. When we look at church attendance rates and educational achievement levels, it would seem the bishops had found a way to bridge the quest for material goods with the search for spiritual happiness. But has this been an unambiguously good thing? Has it persisted? What's happened to it? And is it now any longer a cultural force that may help the new immigrant wave that is replacing the old European wave to see the potential of the dream? In the 1970s, while on the University of Connecticut faculty, I was invited to give lectures to the alumni in various cities and towns in Connecticut. The title of most of these lectures was, "We made it, why can't they?" That's what the newly minted Italians, Irish, Poles, and other ex-plebes of Connecticut were asking me. One of the greater myths of the American dream is that somehow each ethnic group builds itself up the ladder with no help, with each individual doing his or her own pulling. Indeed, a close look, of course, reveals the way prejudice and discrimination may have hindered their kind, but that's hardly the case. They seem to have forgotten the community that was created in the Catholic parish in the earlier years. Now that the white European ethnics have made it, are they more likely to step on the hands of those trying to climb the ladder, or reach down and help them, or simply ignore them? Is there any basis for even imagining reaching down to help? Our new book on American Catholics today shows that the youngest generation of American Catholics is more concerned about reaching out to the poor and the needy than any of their predecessors. Indeed, other data supported our findings, which surprised us, I dare say. Are these young people capable of providing a cushion of support? Not that it would replace the Catholic parish as community, that's not possible. But that will reflect and sustain both elements of the American dream that Dr. Zogby has identified. After all, it was an Irishman named Daly who wrote that poem about Little George Washington. Thank you.
I want to reconvene the panelists that are here, and we want to take at least a few minutes, because you've been so patient, to ask questions either directed at the panel or a particular panelist. We know that some of you have to go, and we understand that, and some more are coming in, but we'd be delighted to take questions should you have them. Yes, sir.
What is the relationship of the American dream to the Republican emphasis on ending the estate tax?
Well, tackle that one, or?
Well, I'll try.
Yeah.
Can you hear me here?
Yeah.
We heard a lot about this notion of equality of opportunity, or equality and opportunity, and what the relationship are to each other. I think most of us believe in the concept, in the abstract, of equality of opportunity. I think many of us probably would disagree violently on what that actually means. I think the core idea behind the republic, lowercase r republic, is that somehow, whatever your aspirations are, the government is not going to get in the way. That there are lots of things that could go wrong in your quest for a dream. You could have bad health, you could have bad luck, but you're not going to have to pay a bribe. You're not going to be oppressed by some government official. And the goal of government somehow is to allow people to realize their dreams. The problem is that there is an apparent need for intervention on the part of the government. I use the word apparent in two contradictory senses. There are some folks who say that need for intervention is apparent and not real. Those folks who want the estate tax would say that we don't really need that intervention to keep the playing field level. It's only an illusion. And there are other folks who would say there's an apparent need for the government to step in, i.e. it's obvious, we need that there are countervailing forces like private capital that would oppress us if we got the chance. So if your notion of apparent is illusory, you're going to be in favor of the estate tax. If your notion of apparent is going to be on the part of intervention, then you're going to be in favor of taxes. We dream as something that unites us, and it does. But very often it divides us about mutually exclusive things.
I want to add a comment there. An extreme example of that thinking is found if you were a fan of All in the Family back in 1972 when McGovern was running on the Democratic ticket, some of you may recall that he was proposing informally that we limit all inheritances to $500,000. And Archie's son-in-law, Michael, the sociology major, asked Archie if he was going to vote for McGovern, since that was really a progressive idea. And Archie screamed at him and said, "What's wrong with you?" He said, "Limited to $500,000. What if I win the lottery tomorrow and it's worth $2 million? I got to give the government all that money."
And in fact, when McGovern made that proposal before a blue-collar audience, he was booed.
Properly don't get. I mean, he acknowledges that Americans have an over-concern with money, but it's not the end. And he claims that he sees that in the data, that they don't think it's the end, but that they're simply caught up by it. So that I think that's part of the question. How far does that relate to the decline in the percentage of Americans who see spiritual happiness as the primary goal of the dream? I mean, we're seeing that change occurring within 10 years after Whitehouse made his argument and Madsen made his counter-argument that we need some kind of a dialogue between a Catholic social teachings approach at the macro level, looking at the community as well as the individual level. So, I think you're asking a question which should be part of our dialogue.
I would just say that you have two competing visions of the dream. I think one would find that very difficult, another would accommodate it pretty well. I think of the Puritans who had a notion of stewardship, not in the same, not in an ecological sense, but I think that there's an elasticity there. The thing that I find interesting about your question, though, is the way in which frugality takes on, I think, what Professor Killing would call a sort of metaphysical. I mean, it's got a kind of physical justification, but there's something almost theological to me about the modern environmental movement in some ways. It's what's interesting to me about it is that there's a very powerful sort of secular quality to it, and you kind of utilitarian dimension to it, as well as a kind of theological or metaphysical one. And in embodying that tension or even contradiction, it perhaps reveals one more way in which that dream is a quintessentially American dream too.
But the American dream is itself protean-like in the sense that it can reconfigure and.
Right, but the thing that makes the American dream, I think, at the essence of it, goes back to something we've talked a lot today, and this notion, Professor talked about bigger and better. I'm not sure an ecologist would talk about bigger and better, but we certainly talk about better. And this notion that you can end up in a different, better place than where you started, whether it's with a Toyota Prius or with a Lincoln Continental, is still better. And in that regard, ecologists are very much in the American dream, a metaphor I use advisedly here.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Someone once defined the American dream to me as the phrase, "we can do better." I was wondering if you thought that still held true today.
Well, I should reveal here that the person who told you that is your teacher, who happens to be in the front of the room here. I do think that goes back to the answer I just gave a minute ago. That we can do better is in some sense the model of the American dream. Whether the accent falls on the we, the can, the do, or the better is going to depend on context. But the belief in better is the essence of it. I don't think people living in the Soviet Union before that empire collapsed would think of we can do better as the motto. I don't think Confucian Chinese, although I did mention in passing that I think there is a Confucian dream. I don't think that better. I mean, in some ways, it's about honoring your ancestors, not outstripping them. The American dream is not necessarily a unique concept in terms of this notion of aspiration, but it does have contours, and I think we can do better. Comes as close as I've been able to figure out about eliminating what's American.
Jim, it's so amazed at the way in which American corporate advertising has control of the American dream. I don't know if you address that in your book, but that's an element here somewhere. I mean, we have our environmentalists out there preaching their gospel, but they don't control the advertising that you see on all the big American shows. If you were a sports buff, God, you're overwhelmed. You're any other kind of TV watcher, that's what overwhelms you, and that's telling you that you can do better, and it shows you how you can do better and what better is. Have you addressed that?
Well, yeah, that's something we've been talking about all along. I mean, you know, the people who run Madison Avenue are the smartest people in the world, as far as I can tell. And one of the ways in which they're so smart is that they are so clever at tapping the metaphysical in order to sell the physical. Jackson Lear's, a great American historian, has used the word the fable of abundance. You know, and there's something actually sort of Catholic about it, really, in terms of its sort of psychological construct. I mean, you know, the very notion of plenty has a kind of religiosity to it, and successful advertisers, I think, are able to endow the products they sell by conferring, you know, this notion of grace on those of us who are lucky enough to buy an iPod. You know, or you know the whole marketing thing of sun-kissed oranges, wrapping them in that paper and selling those calendars. The image of California. You're not just biting into an orange; you're biting into sunshine itself. You know when you buy this thing.
Yeah. John.
I was surprised that there wasn't a lot of discussion about the role of the concept fairness in the American dream, in the way the panel brought this material forward. I was struck by that in your response to the question about the estate tax, because the estate tax was never really sold as the estate tax. It was sold as a death tax, and that there was something something was done unfairly because people worked and at death, the government should take the proceeds of that hard work. So the question of fairness and how you in fact spin or articulate or image fairness, it seems to me, is somewhere deeply within the expectation and the symbols. I steer away from the word metaphysics. The symbols that inform meaning, and I don't think it really came out, except maybe by some inference from your sense that talking to people who said, we made it, but they didn't. There was some unfairness there in people in the 70s. But where's that concept? Isn't there?
Well, I tried to emphasize the idea of fairness in the way in which the book, The Hidden Injuries of Class, attacks it. That is, you are supposed to believe that you have an equal opportunity to get that job, that manager's job. You're one of 120 people applying for that job. And what you need to believe is that if you don't get it, it's because the other person had a little bit more skill, had worked a little bit harder, not that the other person was the son or daughter of the boss. And it was fairness in that sense. In the other sense in which you're talking about fairness, the elimination of the estate tax unfair, I think an awful lot of sociological research shows that we have a kind of significant other reference point. Who are our references? If you're a factory worker, your reference point isn't the boss with the $10 million a year salary. It's the guys next to you or in the other factory doing the same kind of thing you're doing. So our social reference point does not reach out there, and so we don't see that as unfair, whether we should see it or not. Our reference points simply don't reach us out there.
I think, John, there's a tension always in our values between individualism and a heightened sense of individualism and this notion of equality, and that tension has always been there. But I would just make a slightly different argument or throw this out here, and that is that the American dream has really been part of our politics of comfort, because even though there's a tension between those values, we're comfortable with both of them. And of course, we want both of them. And inevitably, one goes too far and there's a pullback. Andy Cohen has some polling out that suggests in the last week that there's, the American public looking at 2008 wants a greater sense of the common good. But maybe we are engaged in a new politics of discomfort when part of that discomfort is not just about race and the new immigrants and what's a family and all the rest, but part of that discomfort may be this disbelief in the idea of the American dream itself, and that something profound is being lost. I don't know if that's right, but I offer that, and it's something I myself need to think more about.
What does fairness mean here? Does fairness mean that anyone can go to Harvard, or does fairness mean that everyone goes to a state school? We can't agree on what does fairness mean. I ask you, sir.
Because it means that fairness is a concept, is a symbol within the society that we refer to and becomes part of the way we measure whether or not we're participating in this reality that we share, because we share the American reality driven by a dream.
But we have conflicting notions of what fairness means. If you do a poll, some folks are going to say fairness means anyone can go to Harvard, whatever your race is, your religion, whatever. Other folks, I suspect you're among them, think of fairness as more of a kind of equitable distribution of resources, as opposed to the potential for anybody to achieve. I'm not sure which of those is better. If I find two others, I'd probably agree with you. But what I think you have to understand is that we disagree with each other without even knowing that we're doing it, because we're using the same word, like fairness, to talk about antithetical things.
Well, I see a number of hands raised, and I want to get to as many people as we possibly can. Steve.
Actually, this picks up on something that you just said, John, and it seems to pick up as well a little bit on the fairness question. One of the things I was surprised in all three papers is a little attention was paid to the dark side of the American dream. A little attention was paid, and I'm really looking forward to Sandy's panel this afternoon, which I assume would pick this up. But is there no recognition that the American dream can, in fact, be repressive, can, in fact, create an ideal, that establishes a norm that all of us need to measure ourselves against? I mean, is that not an important aspect of the American dream? Is that, in fact, not what Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan and so forth, to a certain extent, aren't they actually employing that kind of a norm to create their coalitions for elections?
Or to quote Bruce Springsteen, is the American dream a lie, or does it represent something worse? Right. Yeah.
I want to be very clear about this, and I think I did say that although I didn't dwell on it here, as you say, that I do not regard the American dream as an unambiguously good thing. In fact, I regard the American dream as a haunting thing, a powerful and disturbing psychological fact of our lives. And to illustrate that, I'll just give one small example, which I've thought a lot about, which is that dreams are funny things. You know, we don't really, the paradox of a dream is that it's not democratic. We don't really choose our dreams. Our dreams are given to us by our parents sometimes, and we experience a friction in trying to realize them. Our dreams come to us. We dream for things we badly wish we didn't want, but we do. You know, we fall in love with people that we shouldn't fall in love with. You know, we pine for things that we're never going to get. You know, we wake up in the middle of the night thinking about things that we wish would just go away. And we tend to think of it, and as I think you're indicating, as this sort of unalloyed good. But oh, no, it isn't. On the other hand, dreams sustain us, they keep us alive, they give us a vision of something bigger and larger than ourselves. So I don't want to condemn it either. It's an extraordinarily complex thing. We tend to think of it as simple, and it's anything but. That, to me, was the greatest thing I've learned in doing the book, is that this simple idea is extraordinarily complicated.
Well, I think we're learning here in the first hour that this concept is used in different ways. In fact, so many different ways. You say it's complicated. By the nature of it, it's used by different groups for different purposes. And I think we should approach it as being a weapon. One group uses it as a weapon for their ends. Another group uses it as a weapon for their ends. These use it to mislead the public. These people use it as an active weapon. In fact, it might even be an opiate in some sense. So we should look at it in that respect, and as educators, teach truth in advertising to our students so they can see through this thing, as to where it comes from.
Now, and I would just brief comment, and that is that this is different from aspirations, because aspirations always remain unfulfilled. Bush the first made a fundamental mistake in his presidency by saying he was going to be the education president, the environmental president, because he could never live up to that. Reagan was very smart in the sense of immersing himself in the mythology of American life. And when you do that, and what makes the myth enduring is that it's already fulfilled in our imaginations. But it may be fulfilled in our imaginations somewhat differently, which is going to take us to our next panel. Jim, one last one.
Before you parse this thing to pieces, it seems to me you want to stick with the term America. And secondly, you want to recognize that millions of people for over 2 centuries have wanted to come here for some reason. And you're looking at it from the inside and giving us all the negatives. You know, it's not this and it's not that, and maybe this and maybe that. But for my grandfather and my father and Bill's father, etc., this was a real thing, and it's still true for the guy that cleans my yard. I mean, this is so. Don't discount it so quickly.
I think that's what you meant by the complexity, and what you meant by these two sides. The motivation that it gives people who don't have anything, as well as the falsehood of the fact that we cannot really all make it. And the second panel today, of which I hope that many of you will join us, we're going to break for about 10 minutes and reconvene and look at some cracks in the dream, but still the hope of the dream. And thank you so much.
Well, it's just when nobody talks about and perhaps the success of American dream. Part of our ballet or our ennui right now is the fact that we are afraid of this will end our dominance.